Hey there. Tonight, we venture into the shadowed corners of medieval society, where death was both profession and curse, where the executioner's blade carried not only the weight of justice, but the burden of eternal isolation. In the torch-lit squares of ancient towns, where crowds gathered to witness the final moments of condemned souls, stood a figure both feared and despised, the medieval executioner, a man whose very existence was woven from threads of necessity and revulsion. These were individuals who wielded the instruments of death with practiced precision, yet found themselves trapped within the suffocating confines of social exile, spiritual damnation, and psychological torment that defined their wretched calling. So dim the lights, settle into comfort, and let us drift together into this haunting exploration of why it truly sucked to be a medieval executioner. In the shadowed alleyways of 13th century Europe, where cobblestones gleamed wet with morning dew and the acrid smoke of countless hearth fires mingled with the pungent aromas of unwashed bodies and fermenting ale, there existed a figure who walked perpetually between the realms of the living and the dead. The medieval executioner moved through these narrow streets like a specter, wrapped in coarse woolen robes, his very presence causing merchants to avert their eyes and mothers to pull their children closer to their skirts. In the distance, cathedral bells tolled their ancient rhythms across red-tiled rooftops, while beneath their sacred chimes, this solitary man carried within his calloused hands the weight of society's darkest necessities, forever marked by the crimson stains that no amount of prayer or penance could ever truly wash away. As dawn broke across the timber-framed houses that leaned precariously over bustling market squares, where vendors hawked their wares beneath colorful canvas awnings, and the sweet scent of fresh bread competed with the less pleasant odors of livestock and human waste, the executioner would emerge from his isolated dwelling beyond the city walls. His footsteps echoed hollowly against stone pathways worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims, merchants, and penitents, yet none would walk beside him, for his profession had branded him with an invisible mark more damning than any scarlet letter. The morning light, filtering through latticed windows and dancing across burnished copper vessels in shop fronts, seemed to grow dimmer in his presence, as if the very sun itself recoiled from illuminating one whose trade was the methodical administration of death. Within the cramped confines of medieval towns, where guild artisans plied their honest trades behind workshop doors adorned with intricate iron hinges, and where the gentle murmur of daily commerce created a symphony of human endeavor, the executioner stood as a necessary yet reviled contradiction. While blacksmiths shaped glowing metal into tools of creation, while bakers kneaded dough that would nourish families, while scribes carefully illuminated manuscripts that would preserve knowledge for future generations, this solitary figure was tasked with wielding instruments designed solely for destruction. His was a craft learned not in jovial apprenticeship alongside laughing companions, but in grim solitude, studying the anatomical precision required to deliver swift death, mastering the delicate balance between mercy and justice that his terrible calling demanded. Perhaps most haunting of all was the profound isolation that enveloped the executioner like an eternal winter fog, separating him from the warm fellowship that bound other citizens together in their shared humanity. As evening approached and families gathered around glowing hearths to share simple meals and tell stories beneath the flickering light of tallow candles, while lovers met in moonlit gardens perfumed with lavender and rosemary, while children played innocent games in torch-lit courtyards, the executioner returned alone to his exile, carrying with him the weight of each life he had taken, each final breath he had witnessed, each soul he had dispatched into the unknowable darkness beyond. The medieval executioner existed within a suffocating bubble of social revulsion that followed him through every cobblestone street and market square like an invisible plague. When he approached the bustling wine merchant's stall, where purple grapes spilled from wicker baskets and the sweet aroma of fermentation hung heavy in the afternoon air, conversations would halt mid-sentence as if his very presence had cast a spell of silence over the gathered crowd. Mothers would instinctively shield their children's eyes, pulling them behind the safety of their woolen skirts, while grown men would make the sign of the cross and mutter protective prayers under their breath. The executioner's shadow seemed to carry with it the stench of death itself, though in truth, he had bathed as thoroughly as any citizen, scrubbing his flesh raw in desperate attempts to cleanse himself of the invisible contamination that society insisted clung to his very soul. In the grand halls where nobles feasted beneath glittering chandeliers, where musicians played lilting melodies on polished lutes, and the finest delicacies were served on gleaming silver platters, the executioner's name was spoken only in hushed whispers, if at all. Even the lowest scullery maid in the castle kitchens held a higher social position than this necessary but despised figure. For while she might serve the dregs of wine and scrape grease from cooking pots, her hands were not stained with the deliberate taking of human life. The rigid hierarchy of medieval society, which normally provided clear pathways for advancement through guild membership, military service, or religious devotion, offered no ladder of ascension for one whose profession was fundamentally linked to death and damnation. He remained forever trapped at the very bottom of the social order, below even the meanest beggar, for beggars merely suffered from misfortune, while executioners chose to embrace evil as their daily bread. The crushing weight of this social ostracism extended beyond mere avoidance into active persecution and humiliation that poisoned every aspect of daily existence. In the marketplace, vendors would refuse to sell their finest goods to the executioner, offering instead only the most inferior cuts of meat, the stalest bread, the most watered wine, as if providing quality merchandise to such a figure would somehow taint their own souls. When he walked through the narrow streets where children played with wooden hoops and sang innocent nursery rhymes, their laughter would die on their lips, replaced by fearful stares and pointing fingers that marked him as surely as if he wore the devil's own brand upon his forehead. Tavern keepers would reluctantly serve him ale in the darkest corners of their establishments, far from the warm camaraderie of the central hearth, charging him double the normal price while making it clear that his patronage was neither welcomed nor desired. This profound social exile created a psychological prison more torturous than any physical dungeon. For while the condemned criminals he executed would eventually find release in death, the executioner faced a lifetime sentence of isolation and contempt. He walked among his fellow humans as a living ghost, necessary for the functioning of justice yet forever banished from the community he served, watching from the periphery as others enjoyed the simple pleasures of friendship, acceptance, and belonging that remained perpetually beyond his reach, creating a special kind of hell reserved for those who administered death in the name of righteousness. The terrible burden of the executioner's calling passed from father to son like a cursed inheritance, flowing through bloodlines with the inexorable certainty of a river carved deep into stone. When a young boy born into such a family took his first tentative steps across the threshold of his father's dwelling, his fate was already sealed as surely as if it had been written in the stars themselves. No amount of prayer, no display of scholarly aptitude, no demonstration of artistic talent could alter the predetermined path that stretched before him like a dark tunnel with no visible end. The guilds that welcomed other young men with open arms and promises of prosperity would forever remain closed to him, their doors barred not by his own shortcomings, but by the crimson stain that had marked his lineage for generations past and would continue to mark it for generations yet to come. Within the cramped confines of the executioner's household, where shadows seemed to linger longer than in other homes, and where the very walls appeared to absorb rather than reflect the flickering light of oil lamps, the grim education began before the child could even comprehend its significance. While other boys learned the cheerful songs of harvest festivals and the hopeful prayers of morning mass, the executioner's son absorbed lessons of anatomy and death, studying the precise angle required for a merciful beheading and the careful calculations needed to ensure that a hanging would be swift rather than prolonged. His father's weathered hands, permanently stained despite countless scrubbings with lye soap and blessed water, would guide small fingers over the tools of execution, teaching the weight and balance of each instrument as other fathers might teach their sons the gentle craft of woodworking or the noble art of metalsmithing. The legal and social structures of medieval society formed an impenetrable cage around these hereditary executioners, making escape as impossible as a bird attempting to fly beyond the boundaries of the known world. Royal decrees and municipal laws explicitly forbade executioners from abandoning their posts, for who else would carry out the grim sentences that justice demanded? The authorities understood that allowing executioners to simply walk away would create a dangerous vacuum in the machinery of law and order, leaving courts unable to enforce their most serious judgments. Even if an executioner's son possessed the rare combination of courage and desperation necessary to attempt flight, the distinctive skills he had been forced to acquire marked him as surely as a brand, for no other profession required such intimate knowledge of death's swift administration, and any attempt to hide his background would inevitably crumble under scrutiny. Perhaps most tragic of all was the slow, inexorable process by which these young men came to accept their fate, watching their dreams of alternative futures wither like flowers in winter's grip. The blacksmith's son could dream of becoming a merchant. The merchant's son might aspire to scholarship. The scholar's son could envision a life of military service. But the executioner's son faced a future as fixed and unchangeable as the rising of the sun. As years passed and the weight of inevitability pressed down upon him like a stone upon his chest, he would eventually take up the tools of his father's trade, not out of choice or calling, but because the medieval world offered no other path for one born into such darkness, thus ensuring that the cycle would continue unbroken into the next generation. Beyond the protective embrace of towering stone walls that sheltered honest citizens from bandits and wild beasts, where the comforting glow of hearth fires no longer reached, and where the reassuring sounds of daily commerce faded into haunting silence, the executioner was forced to make his home in perpetual exile. Municipal laws, carved into stone tablets and reinforced by centuries of precedent, explicitly forbade these necessary but contaminated figures from dwelling within the sacred boundaries of the city proper, banishing them to ramshackle hovels that clung to existence in the shadow of the outer fortifications. Here, in this liminal space between civilization and wilderness, where morning mist rose from marshy ground and ravens perched ominously on gnarled oak branches, the executioner's dwelling stood as a monument to society's need to simultaneously employ and reject those who carried out its darkest commands, close enough to summon when justice demanded blood, yet far enough to preserve the spiritual purity of the community within. The executioner's forced residence occupied a plot of land that seemed cursed by its very purpose, where nothing grew properly, despite his desperate attempts at cultivation, and where even the hardiest weeds appeared stunted and sickly. His dwelling, constructed from whatever materials he could scavenge or afford with his irregular income, bore little resemblance to the sturdy, timber-framed houses that lined the city's prosperous streets, with their cheerfully painted shutters and flower boxes overflowing with herbs and blossoms. Instead, his home was a patchwork creation of weathered planks, crumbling mortar, and makeshift repairs that spoke eloquently of isolation and poverty, its single room serving simultaneously as kitchen, workshop, and sleeping chamber, while the tools of his grim trade hung from iron hooks driven into walls that seemed to weep perpetual dampness regardless of the season's warmth or the fire that struggled to heat the inadequate space. The daily journey from this exile to the city center, where his services were required for public executions and the maintenance of the dungeon's darker corners, became a ritual of humiliation that reinforced his status as a necessary evil rather than a valued citizen. Each morning, as the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, the executioner would begin the long walk along muddy paths that wound between abandoned fields and forgotten graveyards, carrying his leather satchel of instruments while avoiding the main roads where merchants and pilgrims might glimpse his approach and cross themselves in protective gestures. The city guards who manned the gates would grudgingly admit him through a special entrance reserved for undesirables, their faces twisted in expressions of disgust and reluctant duty, making it clear that his presence was tolerated only by necessity and that he should complete his business and depart as quickly as possible. This enforced geographical separation created a psychological wound that never healed, a constant reminder that he belonged neither to the world of the living nor the dead, but existed in a twilight realm of his own making. While families gathered around dinner tables laden with fresh bread and roasted meat, sharing stories and laughter beneath the warm glow of beeswax candles, the executioner returned each evening to his solitary hovel beyond the walls, where silence pressed against him like a physical weight, and where the only companions were the restless spirits of those he had dispatched, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same journey, the same rejection, the same inexorable return to the margins of human society. Within the hallowed walls of Gothic cathedrals, where stained glass windows cast rainbow patterns across worn stone floors, and the sweet perfume of frankincense mingled with the whispered prayers of the faithful, the executioner found himself barred from the very salvation that medieval society promised to all who sought redemption. The Church, that great mother of medieval civilization, which opened her arms to murderers and thieves, to adulterers and blasphemers, which welcomed the lowest beggar and the most hardened criminal into her forgiving embrace, turned her back upon the executioner with cold finality. His profession, though sanctioned by temporal authorities and essential for the maintenance of earthly justice, was deemed so fundamentally corrupting that it severed his connection to the divine as surely as if he had signed a contract with Satan himself, leaving his soul to wander in a spiritual wilderness where no amount of penance could restore his standing in the eyes of God. The sacred rituals that marked the passage of life for every other Christian soul remained forever beyond the executioner's reach, creating a profound spiritual isolation that gnawed at his conscience like a persistent wound. When other men knelt before ornate altars to receive the Holy Eucharist, feeling the blessed wafer dissolve upon their tongues as Christ's presence filled their hearts with divine grace, the executioner could only watch from the shadows of the church's outer vestibule, forbidden to partake in the central mystery of Christian faith. The priest's hands, which had been blessed to consecrate the sacred elements and offer absolution to penitent sinners, would never be extended toward the executioner in blessing. For the Church decreed that his very touch would contaminate the sacred vessels and render the holy sacraments impure, as if the blood he had shed in service to justice had permanently stained not only his flesh, but his immortal soul as well. Even in death, when other souls always found comfort in the promise of Christian burial within consecrated ground, surrounded by the graves of faithful ancestors and blessed by the prayers of mourning communities. The executioner faced the prospect of eternal exile from the sacred spaces where generations of believers had laid their bones to rest. No priest would offer the final rites that eased the passage from this world to the next. No holy water would be sprinkled upon his corpse. No sanctified earth would embrace his remains in the hope of resurrection. Instead, his body would be consigned to unhallowed ground beyond the churchyard's protective walls, where suicides and excommunicates found their final resting place among weeds and brambles, unmarked by crosses or headstones, unvisited by mourners who might offer prayers for the repose of his troubled soul. This religious rejection created a profound existential crisis that tormented the executioner throughout his earthly existence. For while he could accept social ostracism and economic hardship as the price of his necessary profession, the loss of eternal salvation struck at the very core of medieval man's understanding of life's purpose and meaning. As he performed his grim duties beneath the unforgiving gaze of heaven, watching condemned souls make their final confessions and receive last rites that would forever be denied to him, the executioner faced the terrible knowledge that his service to earthly justice had purchased his own spiritual damnation, creating a paradox that no amount of philosophical reasoning could resolve, and no earthly authority could ameliorate. The prospect of love and companionship, those fundamental human needs that brightened even the darkest corners of medieval existence, remained tantalizingly beyond the executioner's grasp like sunlight filtering through prison bars. When spring arrived and young couples throughout the village began their tentative courtships, walking hand in hand through blooming meadows where wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze and larks sang their joyful songs from hidden perches, the executioner could only observe from afar, knowing that no respectable family would ever consent to unite their bloodline with one so thoroughly corrupted by death. The daughters of merchants and craftsmen, farmers and scholars, even the humblest serving girls who tended livestock and swept floors, were all forbidden fruit to one whose very touch was believed to carry the stain of eternal damnation, leaving him to navigate the treacherous waters of romantic longing without hope of reaching the safe harbor of matrimonial bliss. Even should some desperate or foolish woman agree to become his bride, perhaps driven by extreme poverty or social desperation to consider such an unholy union, the Church itself would refuse to sanctify their marriage with sacred vows, denying them the blessing that transformed mere physical attraction into a divinely ordained partnership blessed by God Himself. No priest would stand before the altar to join their hands in holy matrimony. No sacred ceremony would unite their souls in the eyes of heaven. No wedding feast would celebrate their union with the joyful participation of family and friends gathered beneath garlands of flowers and flickering candles. Instead, any relationship the executioner might forge would remain forever tainted by illegitimacy, a shadowy arrangement that existed outside the protective boundaries of social acceptance and religious sanction, offering neither the security of legal recognition nor the comfort of divine approval. The few women who might overcome their revulsion and fear to share the executioner's bed were typically drawn from society's most desperate margins. Widows so destitute they had no other choice, prostitutes whose own social standing was scarcely higher than his, or outcasts who had been similarly rejected by respectable society for their own transgressions. These unions, born of mutual desperation rather than genuine affection, carried within them the seeds of their own destruction. For even the most hardened woman would eventually recoil from the reality of sharing her life with one whose hands had taken so many lives, whose dreams were haunted by the faces of the executed, whose very presence seemed to summon the specter of death into their humble dwelling where love should have bloomed. Should children somehow emerge from these troubled unions, they would inherit not only their father's cursed profession, but also the additional burden of illegitimacy, marking them as doubly damned in the eyes of a society that valued bloodline purity above almost all other considerations. These innocent souls, conceived in darkness and born into rejection, would grow up knowing that their very existence was viewed as an abomination, that their mother's association with the executioner had forever tainted her reputation, and that their own future held nothing but the same isolation and despair that had consumed their father, creating an endless cycle of loneliness and social rejection that would continue until the very institution of execution itself finally crumbled into the dust of forgotten history. The executioner's livelihood depended upon the unpredictable rhythms of crime and punishment, creating a grotesque economic reality where his prosperity was directly tied to the misfortunes and moral failings of others, like a vulture that could only feast when death stalked the land. Unlike the steady income that blessed the baker who sold daily bread, the cobbler who mended worn shoes, or the blacksmith whose services were constantly in demand, the executioner's purse remained perpetually uncertain, swelling briefly after a busy season of executions, only to shrink again during peaceful periods when justice slumbered and criminals either reformed their ways or simply avoided capture. His financial fate hung suspended like a condemned man upon the gallows, dependent upon the capricious winds of human nature, the efficiency of local constabulary, and the severity of judicial sentences that might condemn a dozen men to death in a single month, or spare every accused soul for half a year, leaving his coffers as empty as the graves he helped to fill. During times of political upheaval or social unrest, when rebellions flourished and treason stalked the corridors of power like a hungry wolf, the executioner might find himself overwhelmed with work. His services demanded day and night, as authorities sought to restore order through the liberal application of steel and rope. Yet even these periods of grim prosperity carried their own peculiar burdens, for the payment he received was often delayed for months as bureaucratic machinery ground slowly through its ponderous processes, leaving him to subsist on credit and promises, while his rent remained due and his stomach growled with the same hunger that afflicted any other mortal man. The irony of his situation was not lost upon him, that in serving the cause of justice, he often found himself financially desperate enough to consider the very crimes that brought business to his doorstep, though such thoughts were quickly banished, lest they lead him down the path from executioner to executed. The irregular nature of his income made it impossible to plan for the future or accumulate the modest savings that might provide security in times of illness or old age, trapping him in a perpetual cycle of feast and famine that wore away at his peace of mind like water eroding stone. When executions were frequent, he might afford decent cuts of meat and fresh bread, perhaps even a cup of wine to help him forget the day's grim labors. But when months passed without a single death sentence, he would find himself reduced to foraging for roots and berries like a common vagrant, his tools growing rusty from disuse while his skills atrophied, and his reputation for swift, merciful endings began to fade from public memory, making his eventual return to work all the more difficult, and his performance all the more uncertain. Most cruel of all was the knowledge that his financial security depended upon society's darkest impulses, requiring him to hope for crime and pray for punishment in a twisted inversion of normal human desires, where other men might celebrate a peaceful season free from violence and bloodshed. The executioner faced such periods with growing dread, watching his meager savings dwindle away like snow beneath the spring sun, while he waited for the next wave of human wickedness to wash ashore and provide him with the terrible work that kept him alive, creating a psychological burden almost as heavy as the physical weight of his blood-stained axe. The constant immersion in death's cold embrace left its mark upon the executioner's flesh and spirit, with the inexorable certainty of water wearing away stone, transforming him gradually from a man into something that existed in the shadowy borderland between the living and the dead. His hands, once perhaps capable of gentle caresses or the delicate work of craftsmanship, became permanently stained with crimson that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase, the iron scent of blood clinging to his fingers like an invisible shroud that marked him as surely as any brand burned into his flesh. Over years of wielding heavy axes and adjusting rope nooses, his shoulders grew stooped and his back bent beneath the accumulated weight of countless deaths, while his eyes took on the hollow, distant quality of one who had gazed too often into the abyss of human mortality and found that the abyss had begun to gaze back into him with equal intensity. The psychological toll of his profession carved deep furrows through his mind, like a plow cutting through virgin soil, leaving behind a landscape forever altered by the seeds of trauma that took root in the darkness of his troubled consciousness. Sleep became an elusive luxury as the faces of the executed returned night after night to haunt his dreams, their final words echoing through the corridors of his memory like whispered accusations that followed him into the waking world. Some nights he would bolt upright in his narrow bed, cold sweat beading upon his forehead as phantom screams pierced the silence of his isolated dwelling, while other nights he would lie motionless for hours, staring at the ceiling beams as an endless parade of condemned souls marched through his thoughts, each one carrying with them the weight of their final moments and the knowledge that he had been the instrument of their transition from life to whatever realm awaited beyond the veil of death. The executioner's relationship with his own mortality became profoundly distorted through this constant exposure to death's various forms, creating a morbid fascination that bordered on the pathological, as he found himself unable to view any living creature without calculating the precise method by which its life might be most efficiently ended. When he observed children playing in village squares, their laughter ringing like silver bells through the afternoon air, his mind would involuntarily catalog the fragility of their necks, the delicate architecture of their skulls, the ease with which their innocent joy could be transformed into eternal silence. This macabre preoccupation extended even to his own reflection, which he would study in polished metal surfaces with the detached interest of a scholar examining a particularly fascinating specimen, wondering when death would finally claim him, and whether his own ending would be swift and merciful or prolonged and agonizing. Perhaps most devastating of all was the gradual erosion of his capacity for human empathy, as the repetitive nature of his work slowly numbed his ability to connect with the suffering of others or to experience the full range of emotions that made life bearable for ordinary mortals. What had once been a necessary hardening of his heart to perform his duties efficiently had metastasized into a spiritual cancer that consumed his ability to feel joy, compassion, or love, leaving him emotionally hollow and psychologically barren, a walking corpse who continued to breathe and move through the motions of existence while remaining as dead inside as the criminals he dispatched, trapped forever in a twilight state between living and dying that offered neither the peace of death nor the vibrant experience of truly being alive. The executioner's garments served as a visual proclamation of his cursed profession, marking him as distinctly and permanently as a leper's bell announced the approach of one afflicted with that dreaded disease. Municipal laws and ancient customs dictated that he must dress in clothing that immediately identified his dark calling to any observer, typically requiring him to wear robes of deep crimson or midnight black, colors that symbolized the blood he shed and the shadow of death that followed in his wake like a faithful hound. These garments, often patched and mended due to his irregular income, hung upon his frame with the weight of centuries of tradition, each thread woven with the accumulated fear and revulsion of countless generations who had decreed that death's servant must be instantly recognizable, forever preventing him from blending anonymously into the crowd of ordinary citizens who went about their daily business in the comfortable disguise of respectability. Upon his head, the executioner was often compelled to wear a distinctive hood or cap that concealed his features while simultaneously advertising his profession, creating the paradoxical effect of hiding his identity while making his calling unmistakably clear to all who encountered him. This covering, frequently adorned with symbolic decorations such as skulls, crossbones, or other emblems of mortality, served the dual purpose of protecting his anonymity from potential revenge seekers while ensuring that no one could claim ignorance of his nature and accidentally engage him in normal social discourse. The fabric of these hoods, stained with sweat and tears shed in the privacy of his isolation, became as much a part of his identity as his own skin, transforming his face into a blank canvas upon which society projected its darkest fears and most primitive superstitions about death and divine retribution. Specific accessories and ornaments further marked the executioner's status, creating a complete costume of condemnation that left no aspect of his appearance untouched by the stigma of his profession. Around his waist, he might wear a belt of distinctive design, often decorated with miniature replicas of his tools, or inscribed with Latin phrases that spoke of justice and mortality, while his boots were frequently required to be of a particular style or color that would immediately identify his passage to any who examined his footprints in the mud of market squares or the dust of country roads. Even his walking staff, if he carried one, bore the unmistakable marks of his calling, carved with symbols that warned travelers of his approach and reminded all who saw him that death walked among them in human form, patient and inevitable as the turning of the seasons. The psychological impact of this enforced costume extended far beyond mere identification, becoming a form of psychological armor that protected him from the full weight of human contact, while simultaneously serving as a constant reminder of his isolation from normal society. Each morning, as he donned these garments of separation, the executioner underwent a transformation that was both practical and spiritual, shedding whatever remnants of ordinary humanity he might have possessed, and assuming the role that fate and society had thrust upon him. The clothes became a second skin that he could never truly remove, for even when he stripped them away in the privacy of his exile, their invisible weight remained pressed against his soul, marking him as permanently and indelibly as any brand burned into living flesh, ensuring that he would remain forever recognizable as death's servant, until the day when death finally claimed him as its own. The warm glow of tavern windows, where amber ale flowed freely, and the companionship of fellow men created bonds of friendship forged in shared laughter and whispered confidences, remained forever beyond the executioner's reach, like a mirage shimmering in the desert of his isolation. When evening shadows lengthened across cobblestone streets and honest workers gathered in smoke-filled common rooms to celebrate the day's labors with hearty meals and flowing wine, the executioner could only peer through diamond-paned windows at scenes of fellowship that seemed as distant as the stars themselves. Tavern keepers, bound by both superstition and municipal ordinance, would bar their doors against his approach, fearing that his presence would drive away paying customers and bring ill fortune upon their establishments. For who would willingly drink ale that had been poured by hands that had served death's cursed messenger, or share bread at tables where such a figure had once broken his fast? The bustling marketplace, where merchants hawked their wares beneath colorful canvas awnings, and the air rang with the cheerful cacophony of commerce and human interaction, became a labyrinth of rejection and humiliation, through which the executioner was forced to navigate with the careful precision of a ship avoiding hidden reefs. Vendors would cover their goods when they glimpsed his distinctive garments approaching, as if his very gaze might spoil fresh bread or curdle milk, while customers would hastily conclude their transactions and melt away into the crowd like morning mist before the rising sun. Even the simple act of purchasing necessities became an ordeal of whispered negotiations conducted in shadowy corners, where prices were inflated and quality was often inferior. For those who served him did so reluctantly and with the obvious desire to conclude their business as quickly as possible before contamination could spread to their legitimate customers. Religious festivals and public celebrations, those joyous occasions when entire communities gathered to honor saints or celebrate seasonal changes with music, dancing, and elaborate feasts spread beneath the open sky, were transformed into painful reminders of the executioner's permanent exile from human society. While children ran laughing through streets decorated with garlands of flowers and colored ribbons, while young couples danced to the lilting melodies of lute and pipe, while families shared roasted meats and sweet pastries prepared especially for these sacred observances, the executioner could only watch from the periphery, hidden in doorways or behind market stalls, observing the happiness that would forever remain beyond his grasp. His presence at such gatherings was not merely unwelcome, but actively prohibited by both written law and unwritten custom. For it was believed that death's servant would bring misfortune upon any celebration he attended, causing crops to fail, livestock to sicken, and marriages to end in sorrow. Even the most basic public spaces, the village well where women gathered to draw water and exchange gossip, the church steps where men conducted business and discussed matters of local importance, the mill where farmers brought their grain to be ground into flour, became territories from which the executioner was effectively banished through the simple but devastating weapon of collective shunning. The invisible boundaries that surrounded these places of normal human interaction were as impermeable as castle walls, defended not by soldiers or weapons, but by the far more powerful force of social revulsion, creating a prison without bars that confined him to the margins of existence, while the vibrant life of the community continued just beyond his reach, tantalizing and forever unattainable. The executioner's already degraded existence was further polluted by a constellation of additional duties that transformed him from a specialist in death into society's universal receptacle for every task deemed too vile or contaminating for respectable citizens to perform. Beyond the grim theater of public executions, he found himself compelled to serve as the community's chief collector of human waste, trudging through narrow alleyways in the pre-dawn hours, with cart and shovel to gather the night soil that accumulated in overflowing latrines and refuse pits, breathing air thick with the acrid stench of decomposition, while decent folk slumbered peacefully in their beds. untroubled by the knowledge of who removed the evidence of their bodily functions. This revolting labor, performed in darkness to spare the sensibilities of those who benefited from his services, left him perpetually saturated with odors that no amount of washing could completely eliminate, ensuring that even when he had bathed and changed his clothes, the invisible miasma of filth clung to him like a second skin that marked his passage through the world. Within the dank confines of the municipal prison, where condemned souls awaited their final judgment in cells that reeked of despair and human misery, the executioner served as jailer, torturer, and keeper of the damned, his duties extending far beyond the simple administration of death to encompass every aspect of institutionalized suffering. He was responsible for feeding the prisoners their meager rations of stale bread and brackish water, for emptying the buckets that served as their only sanitation, for applying the thumbscrews and stretching racks that extracted confessions from reluctant lips, and for maintaining the instruments of interrogation that transformed living men into broken shells, ready to embrace death as a merciful release. The psychological weight of these duties pressed upon him with crushing intensity. For while the swift execution of a condemned criminal could be viewed as an act of justice or even mercy, the prolonged torment of investigation and imprisonment required him to cultivate cruelty as a professional skill, systematically destroying human dignity and hope with the methodical precision that others might apply to carpentry or metalworking. The maintenance of torture chambers and execution grounds demanded expertise in the most macabre aspects of human anatomy and engineering, forcing the executioner to become a scholar of suffering who understood precisely how much pain the human body could endure before death provided escape from agony. He was required to keep the instruments of torment in perfect working order, sharpening blades, oiling hinges, testing the tension of ropes and chains with the same attention to detail that a master craftsman might lavish upon the tools of his honest trade. The irony was not lost upon him that while other artisans created objects of beauty and utility that enriched human life, his craftsmanship served only to perfect the mechanisms of pain and death, requiring him to take pride in work that any civilized person would view with horror and revulsion. Perhaps most demoralizing of all was the knowledge that these additional duties were assigned to him not because they required any special skill or training, but simply because society had determined that one who was already damned by his association with death could not be further contaminated by contact with filth, violence, and human degradation. He had become a living repository for every task that decent people refused to perform, a human sewer into which the community poured all of its darkest necessities, transforming him from a man with a specific profession into a creature whose very existence was defined by his willingness to embrace the shadows that others spent their lives avoiding. The executioner's craft demanded mastery of death's many forms, each requiring years of study and practice to perfect the delicate balance between swift mercy and prolonged agony that separated the skilled professional from the brutal amateur. The art of beheading, perhaps the most prestigious of his techniques, required an intimate understanding of human anatomy that would have impressed the finest physicians, for the axe must strike with perfect precision at the exact point where vertebrae met skull, delivering death in a single clean stroke that spared both victim and audience the horror of botched attempts. Hours were spent in solitary practice, perfecting the stance, the grip, the angle of approach that would ensure the heavy blade would bite through flesh and bone with the efficiency of a master carpenter splitting seasoned oak, while the executioner's muscles memorized the precise movements that could grant a condemned soul the mercy of instantaneous oblivion rather than the nightmare of multiple blows that left them writhing in agony before assembled crowds who had come expecting swift justice, not prolonged torture. The science of hanging presented its own complex challenges, requiring the executioner to calculate rope length, knot placement, and drop distance with mathematical precision that based on the condemned person's weight, height, and physical condition. For too short a drop would result in slow strangulation that could last for agonizing minutes, while too long a drop might tear the head completely from the body in a grotesque spectacle that would haunt witnesses for years to come. The noose itself was a work of craftsmanship. Its 13 coils wound according to ancient tradition, positioned precisely beneath the left ear to ensure that the sudden jerk of falling weight would snap the neck cleanly rather than merely crushing the windpipe and leaving the victim to dangle in prolonged suffering. Even the construction of the gallows required expertise, for the platform must be built to exact specifications that would support the weight of multiple officials while providing the proper height for the fatal drop, with trapdoors that opened smoothly and mechanisms that functioned flawlessly when the moment of judgment arrived. More specialized forms of execution demanded even greater technical knowledge, as the executioner was expected to operate complex mechanical devices such as the breaking wheel, where condemned criminals were tied spread-eagle across wooden spokes, while iron bars shattered their bones in sequence, or the rack, which slowly stretched victims until joints dislocated and sinews snapped like overstressed violin strings. The proper use of fire required understanding of wind patterns, fuel selection, and the precise arrangement of kindling that would ensure flames consumed flesh quickly rather than smoldering slowly in a display of unintended cruelty, while drowning demanded knowledge of water depth, current strength, and the physiological processes that determined how long consciousness could be maintained beneath the surface of rivers or specially constructed ducking pools. Perhaps most challenging of all was the requirement to adapt these techniques to accommodate the specific crimes and social status of different victims. For while a common thief might be dispatched with simple efficiency, a noble traitor required methods that acknowledged his rank even in death, and heretics demanded procedures that symbolically purified their corrupted souls through purging flames. The executioner thus became a dark scholar of mortality, studying not only the mechanical aspects of death, but also its social, religious, and symbolic dimensions, transforming each execution into a carefully choreographed performance that served justice, satisfied bloodthirsty crowds, and maintained the delicate balance between mercy and retribution that kept medieval society functioning within its rigid hierarchical framework. The executioner's most dreaded moments unfolded beneath the merciless gaze of hundreds of spectators who gathered in market squares and execution grounds like ravenous wolves drawn to the scent of blood, their faces twisted with a mixture of morbid fascination and righteous fury that transformed ordinary citizens into a baying mob hungry for retribution. These public spectacles, designed to demonstrate the power of justice and the consequences of transgression, placed the executioner at the center of a theatrical performance where any mistake, any display of hesitation or incompetence would be met with jeers, curses, and potentially violent retaliation from a crowd that expected death to be delivered with the precision of a master craftsman and the solemnity of a religious ritual. The weight of their collective expectations pressed upon his shoulders like a mountain of stone, for he understood that a botched execution would not only prolong the victim's suffering, but could also incite the assembled masses to violence, turning their bloodthirst toward him as the instrument of their disappointment and rage. The psychological pressure of performing under such scrutiny was compounded by the executioner's awareness that among the sea of upturned faces might be hidden the relatives, friends, or confederates of the condemned, individuals who viewed him not as an agent of justice, but as a murderer deserving of revenge and who might even now be planning retribution against him or his family. Every eye that watched his preparations seemed to burn with accusation. Every whispered comment from the crowd carried the potential for future threat. Every cheer that greeted the fall of his axe or the drop of the hanged man's body reminded him that his fellow humans found entertainment in the very acts that tormented his conscience and stained his soul with indelible guilt. The carnival atmosphere that often surrounded these events, with vendors selling food and ale, children running between the legs of adults, and couples treating the occasion as a social gathering, created a surreal backdrop against which the executioner was forced to perform the most solemn and terrible duty that one human being could inflict upon another. The technical demands of public execution were magnified exponentially by the need to perform flawlessly before an audience that had no understanding of the skill required, but possessed infinite capacity for criticism and complaint when expectations were not met with perfect precision. Unlike the private tortures conducted in dungeon cells, where mistakes could be corrected without witnesses, the public execution allowed for no second chances, no opportunity to adjust technique or compensate for equipment failure, for the crowd demanded immediate satisfaction and would not tolerate delays or complications that disrupted their carefully anticipated spectacle of justice. The executioner's hands, which might tremble with nervousness or fatigue, must remain steady beneath the weight of public scrutiny. His voice must project confidence and authority, even when his heart raced with anxiety, and his movements must convey the gravitas appropriate to his role as society's instrument of divine retribution. Most torturous of all was the executioner's knowledge that the very people who demanded his services, who cheered his efficient dispatching of criminals, and who relied upon him to maintain order through the application of lethal force, would turn against him instantly if he failed to meet their expectations or if political winds shifted and made him a convenient scapegoat for society's accumulated guilt over its bloodthirsty appetites, leaving him forever suspended between necessity and revulsion, between social utility and personal condemnation, performing his grim duties beneath the unforgiving gaze of those who needed him but would never accept him. In the shadowed margins of medieval society, where respectable citizens feared to tread and where the normal rules of social interaction dissolved like morning mist, the executioner found himself thrust into reluctant fellowship with others who had been cast out from the warm circle of human acceptance. Here, among the lepers with their warning bells and rotting flesh, the prostitutes who sold their bodies to survive in a world that offered them no other means of sustenance, the mad wanderers whose minds had been shattered by divine affliction or demonic possession, and the thieves who lurked in dark alleyways waiting for unwary travelers. The executioner discovered a strange kinship born not of choice but of mutual rejection by the society that had branded them all as untouchable. Yet even within this community of the damned, his position remained uniquely isolated, for while others had fallen into sin through weakness, desperation, or misfortune, he alone had chosen to embrace death as his profession, making him an object of fear and revulsion even among those who understood the bitter taste of social exile. The prostitutes who plied their trade in tavern corners and back-alley brothels, women whose bodies had become commodities in the marketplace of human desire, would sometimes offer him their services not out of attraction, but from the desperate calculation that his coin spent as well as any other, though they would demand payment in advance and insist that he bathe thoroughly before any intimate contact. These transactions, conducted in whispered negotiations beneath the cover of darkness, carried an air of mutual desperation that left both parties feeling somehow diminished, For while the women needed his money to survive another day in their precarious existence, he needed their touch to remember what it felt like to be human, rather than merely an instrument of death. Yet even these brief encounters were tainted by the knowledge that the women who lay beneath him did so with barely concealed revulsion, their eyes closed tight against the sight of hands that had taken so many lives, their bodies rigid with the effort of suppressing their natural instinct to flee from one who carried the stench of the grave in his very pores. Among the beggars and vagabonds who haunted the outskirts of towns, seeking scraps of food and shelter from the elements, the executioner found a measure of acceptance born from shared hardship and mutual understanding of what it meant to exist beyond the protective boundaries of civilized society. These ragged souls, many of them bearing the scars of past violence or the ravages of disease, would sometimes share their meager fires on cold nights, offering him warmth and companionship without judgment or questions about his past. For they understood that survival in the margins required a suspension of moral niceties that those who lived in comfort could never comprehend. In their company, he could almost forget the weight of his profession, listening to their tales of adventure and misfortune while contributing his own stories carefully edited to remove the most damning details of his daily work. Yet even these fragile bonds of fellowship carried within them the seeds of their own destruction. For the executioner's association with death made him a figure of superstition and fear that could never be fully overcome by even the most desperate camaraderie, leaving him forever suspended between two worlds, too corrupted for acceptance by respectable society, yet too tainted by his profession to find complete peace even among the outcasts and misfits who formed the only community willing to tolerate his presence in their midst. The medieval mind, steeped in superstition and ancient folklore, wove around the executioner a tapestry of dark beliefs that transformed him from a mere civil servant into a creature of supernatural dread, a walking embodiment of death itself, who carried within his very essence the power to curse, blight, and destroy through the malevolent forces that had accumulated around his profession like iron filings drawn to a lodestone. Common folk whispered that his touch could wither crops in the field, turn fresh milk sour in the pail, and cause pregnant women to miscarry merely by his presence in their vicinity. For it was believed that the countless souls he had dispatched clung to him like invisible parasites, their restless spirits seeking revenge against the living world through the one who had severed their connection to earthly existence. Children would cross themselves and flee when they glimpsed his distinctive garments approaching, while mothers would hang iron horseshoes and bundles of protective herbs above their doorways to ward off the evil influences that supposedly radiated from his cursed form like heat from a forge. The executioner's blood was considered both powerfully magical and dangerously contaminated, leading to a bizarre marketplace where desperate individuals would secretly seek him out to purchase drops of his vital essence for use in dark rituals, love potions, and curses against their enemies, while simultaneously believing that any contact with his bodily fluids would bring eternal damnation upon their souls. Wise women and village healers would pay substantial sums for his hair or fingernail clippings, ingredients they claimed were essential for the most potent spells and incantations. Yet these same practitioners would demand that he leave payment in designated locations, rather than conducting face-to-face transactions. So great was their fear of direct contact with one who dwelt so intimately with death. The rope used in hangings was particularly prized as a magical artifact, with pieces of hemp that had touched a condemned neck selling for prices that could feed a family for weeks, though buyers would only handle these talismans while wearing thick gloves and would store them in blessed containers to contain their supernatural corruption. Even the executioner's tools became objects of supernatural reverence and terror, imbued with mystical properties that made them both coveted and feared by those who trafficked in the occult arts and forbidden knowledge that flourished in the shadows of medieval society. His axe was believed to retain the essence of every soul it had severed, transforming it into a weapon of incredible power that could allegedly cut through spiritual barriers as easily as it cleaved through flesh and bone, while the blocks upon which countless heads had rolled were thought to be saturated with the life force of the executed, making them valuable components in necromantic rituals designed to communicate with the dead or bind restless spirits to the will of ambitious sorcerers. The very ground upon which he walked was considered cursed, with grass refusing to grow in his footsteps and animals avoiding paths he had recently traveled, creating visible evidence of his supernatural contamination that reinforced the popular belief that he had somehow transcended normal human limitations and become something altogether more sinister and otherworldly. The executioner found himself trapped within this web of superstitious beliefs that granted him a terrible kind of power, while simultaneously ensuring his perpetual isolation from normal human society. For while some sought him out for his supposed magical abilities, far more fled from his presence in terror, creating a lonely existence where he wielded influence through fear rather than respect, commanded attention through dread rather than admiration, and achieved a kind of immortality through the dark legends that would outlive his mortal flesh. The executioner's relationship with the law that he served so faithfully was marked by a cruel irony that placed him simultaneously above and below its protection, creating a legal limbo where he was empowered to take life in the name of justice, yet remained vulnerable to every form of abuse and exploitation that those in authority chose to inflict upon him. While his office granted him the terrible privilege of wielding state-sanctioned violence against condemned criminals, this same position stripped him of the basic legal protections that shielded ordinary citizens from arbitrary punishment, leaving him dependent upon the whims and moods of nobles, magistrates, and municipal authorities who could dismiss, punish, or even execute him without the burden of formal charges or due process. His existence balanced precariously upon the knife edge of political expediency, where a change in leadership, a shift in public sentiment, or the need for a convenient scapegoat could transform him from an instrument of justice into a victim of the very system he had served with such grim dedication, his years of loyal service counting for nothing when measured against the demands of political survival. The contracts and agreements that bound the executioner to his duties were invariably weighted in favor of the authorities who employed him, creating a feudal relationship that granted him neither the security of permanent employment nor the freedom to seek alternative work, trapping him in a professional prison that offered only the illusion of choice while constraining his every action within narrow parameters defined by others. His compensation was frequently delayed, reduced, or withheld, entirely based on the arbitrary decisions of officials who understood that his social isolation left him with no recourse to legal remedies or collective bargaining, for what court would hear the complaints of one whose very profession marked him as an enemy of civilized society? When disputes arose over payment, working conditions, or the scope of his duties, the executioner found himself arguing from a position of complete powerlessness, unable to threaten resignation because his specialized skills made him unemployable elsewhere, yet equally unable to demand fair treatment because his degraded status placed him beneath the consideration of those who held power over his fate. The absence of legal protection extended beyond mere employment disputes to encompass every aspect of the executioner's existence, leaving him perpetually vulnerable to violence, theft, and persecution by those who viewed him as fair game for whatever cruelties they wished to inflict upon a convenient target. When angry relatives of executed criminals sought revenge for their losses, they could attack the executioner with relative impunity, knowing that few witnesses would come forward to testify on behalf of one so universally despised, and that even fewer magistrates would pursue justice for crimes committed against society's most reviled figure. His property could be vandalized, his modest possessions stolen, his person assaulted. Yet the wheels of justice that turned so efficiently when he wielded the axe or adjusted the noose ground to a halt when he sought protection from the very authorities he served, creating a system where he bore all the risks and responsibilities of his position while enjoying none of its theoretical benefits or safeguards. Most devastating of all was the knowledge that his legal vulnerability extended even to his family members, who inherited not only his cursed profession, but also his defenseless status before the law, creating a hereditary condition of powerlessness that could be passed down through generations like a genetic disease, ensuring that the cycle of exploitation and abuse would continue long after his own death had finally freed him from the burden of serving a system that used him while despising him. The transmission of death's dark arts from master to apprentice unfolded in shadowy chambers where no guild hall would welcome such instruction, where no formal ceremonies marked the passage of knowledge, and where the sacred bond between teacher and student was corrupted by the terrible nature of the skills being imparted. Unlike the joyful apprenticeships that characterized honest trades, where young men learned carpentry beneath sunny workshop eaves or mastered metalworking beside glowing forges while sharing meals and stories with their mentors, the executioner's son received his education in the grim techniques of human destruction through whispered lessons conducted in the flickering light of tallow candles, his small hands guided by calloused fingers as they learned to grip the instruments of death with the proper angle and pressure required for swift, merciful endings. The father's voice, heavy with the weight of accumulated trauma and bitter experience, would drone through anatomical explanations that no child should ever hear, describing the precise location where vertebrae met skull, the exact pressure needed to snap a neck cleanly, and the mathematical calculations required to ensure that a hanging would deliver instant death rather than prolonged strangulation. The psychological burden of teaching such skills to one's own offspring created a unique form of torment that ate away at the executioner's soul like acid consuming metal. For while other fathers took pride in passing down their knowledge and watching their sons master the techniques that would provide them with honest livelihoods, the executioner faced the horrible necessity of corrupting his child's innocence with the same dark wisdom that had destroyed his own peace of mind. Each lesson became an act of spiritual violence against the boy who should have been learning to read, to pray, to create rather than destroy. Yet circumstances demanded that he be transformed into an instrument of death before he had even reached the age when other children began formal schooling. The father's hands would shake as he demonstrated the proper grip on an executioner's axe, knowing that he was condemning his son to the same life of isolation, revulsion, and psychological torment that had made his own existence a living nightmare, yet understanding that failure to provide this education would leave the boy unprepared for the only profession that society would permit him to practice. The technical aspects of this morbid education encompassed not only the physical mechanics of execution, but also the psychological techniques required to maintain emotional distance from the human suffering that would become his daily bread. Lessons in compartmentalization and emotional numbing that were perhaps more damaging than the instruction in lethal techniques. The young apprentice learned to view condemned criminals not as fellow human beings with families, hopes, and fears, but as problems to be solved efficiently and cleanly, developing the mental callousness that would allow him to sleep at night after spending his days taking lives in service to abstract concepts of justice and social order. He studied the art of reading crowds, understanding when spectators were growing restless and demanding swifter action, learning to gauge the political winds that might make certain executions more or less popular, depending upon the victim's social status or the nature of their alleged crimes. Most tragically of all, this perverted form of education created an unbreakable chain that bound future generations to the same cursed existence, as each executioner was compelled by necessity and tradition to transform his innocent children into the instruments of their own damnation, perpetuating a cycle of spiritual destruction that would continue until the very institution of public execution finally crumbled into the dust of historical obsolescence. The executioner's nights were haunted not only by the ghosts of those he had dispatched, but by the very real threat of vengeance from grieving relatives who viewed him not as an agent of justice but as the murderer of their beloved dead, creating a perpetual state of vigilance where every shadow might conceal a blade, and every stranger's approach might herald his own violent end. In the flickering candlelight of his isolated dwelling, where wind whistled through gaps in the walls and every creak of settling timber might mask the footsteps of an assassin, he would lie awake listening for sounds that did not belong to the night's natural symphony, his hand never far from the knife he kept beneath his pillow, and his ears straining to distinguish between the innocent scurrying of rats and the stealthy movement of human feet across the threshold of his domain. The mothers of executed sons, their hearts shattered by grief and their minds consumed with thoughts of retribution, posed perhaps the greatest threat, for their pain transformed them into creatures of pure vengeance who would stop at nothing to balance the scales of suffering by taking from the executioner what he had taken from them. The executioner's movements through the world became a careful dance of paranoia and precaution, as he learned to vary his routes, to avoid predictable patterns, and to trust no one completely in a world where gold could purchase loyalty and blood demanded satisfaction, regardless of legal niceties or moral justifications. Brothers of the executed would sometimes spend months or even years planning their revenge, studying the executioner's habits with the patience of dedicated hunters, learning when he visited the market, where he drew water for his daily needs, and which paths he favored when traveling between his exile and the city where his services were required. These vengeful souls understood that the law would turn a blind eye to violence committed against one so universally despised, making their task easier and their eventual escape more likely, for what magistrate would pursue justice too vigorously for the death of society's most reviled figure, especially when public sentiment might secretly applaud such an outcome as a form of poetic justice. The threat extended beyond the executioner himself to encompass anyone unfortunate enough to be associated with him, creating a web of danger that ensnared innocent bystanders and made every human contact a potential liability that could result in bloodshed and tragedy. Merchants who sold him food, women who might share his bed, even children who played too close to his dwelling could find themselves targeted by those who sought to punish the executioner through attacks on anyone who showed him kindness or tolerance. This isolation of association meant that even the most desperate members of society would think twice before offering him assistance, knowing that their charity might be repaid with violence from relatives of the executed, who viewed any aid given to their tormentor as collaboration worthy of the same fate they planned for their primary target. Perhaps most insidious of all was the psychological warfare that preceded physical attacks, as vengeful relatives would sometimes engage in campaigns of intimidation designed to drive the executioner to madness before delivering the killing blow, leaving threatening messages carved into trees near his dwelling, depositing the severed heads of animals on his doorstep, or following him through the streets while making throat-cutting gestures that promised future violence, transforming his already miserable existence into a waking nightmare where death might come at any moment from any direction, delivered by hands motivated not by justice, but by the ancient human need for blood to answer blood. The executioner's desperate flight from the horrors of his profession led him inevitably to the temporary oblivion that could be found at the bottom of ale tankards and wine cups, where the amber liquid promised to wash away the stains of memory that no amount of soap and water could cleanse from his tormented soul. In the darkest corners of disreputable taverns, where shadows gathered like conspirators, and the air hung thick with smoke from tallow candles and unwashed bodies, he would sit hunched over rough wooden tables, methodically consuming whatever alcoholic poison was available to numb the screaming voices in his head and blur the vivid images that replayed endlessly behind his closed eyelids. The drink became his only reliable companion in a world that had rejected him completely, offering the blessed release of unconsciousness where the faces of the executed could not follow, and where the weight of his accumulated sins might be temporarily lifted from shoulders that had grown permanently stooped beneath their burden of guilt and self-loathing. Each execution drove him deeper into the bottle's embrace, as the only way to silence the echo of final words, the memory of eyes pleading for mercy, and the terrible sound of life leaving human bodies was to drown these sensations in sufficient quantities of fermented grain and grape until consciousness itself became negotiable. The night following a particularly difficult execution would find him stumbling through narrow alleyways, seeking any establishment desperate enough for coin to serve one of his cursed profession, paying inflated prices for watered wine and bitter ale while enduring the disgusted stares of other patrons who tolerated his presence only because his money spent as readily as any honest man's currency. His consumption followed a predictable pattern that began with measured sips designed to take the edge off his anxiety and inevitably progressed to desperate gulping as the memories pressed against his defenses like floodwaters testing a crumbling dam, until finally blessed unconsciousness claimed him, and he would collapse wherever he sat, his body providing its own merciful ending to another day of existence he could barely endure. The physical toll of this chronic intoxication compounded the already considerable health risks of his profession, as his liver struggled to process the constant stream of alcohol while his body withered from poor nutrition and neglect, creating a downward spiral where drink became both the cause of his deteriorating condition and the only remedy he could imagine for the pain that drove him to such extremes. His hands, which needed to remain steady for the precise work of execution, would shake uncontrollably when deprived of alcohol for too long, while his eyes grew perpetually bloodshot and his speech slurred even when he attempted sobriety, making him appear even more monstrous to a society that already viewed him as barely human. The irony was not lost on him that while he was paid to deliver swift, clean deaths to others, he was slowly killing himself through the very substance that made his continued existence bearable, creating a form of prolonged suicide that matched the gradual destruction of his spirit and his humanity. Yet even alcohol could not provide complete escape from the nightmares that plagued his sleep, as the spirits of the executed seemed to follow him even into his drunken stupors, appearing in dreams where they demanded explanations for their deaths or promised revenge upon his soul, leaving him to wake in cold sweats with the taste of bile and cheap wine burning his throat, while phantom screams echoed in his ears, driving him immediately back to the bottle in a cycle of self-medication that offered no true healing, only temporary postponement of the inevitable reckoning with the accumulated trauma of his cursed calling. The executioner's tortured soul yearned desperately for the redemption that the Church promised to all sinners, yet found himself trapped in a theological paradox, where the very institution that preached forgiveness and divine mercy had branded him irredeemably beyond salvation's reach, creating a spiritual agony that perhaps exceeded even the psychological torment of his daily duties. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the weight of accumulated guilt pressed upon his chest like a stone tomb, he would sometimes creep to the doors of cathedral and chapel, kneeling on cold stones worn smooth by countless generations of penitence, while whispering prayers that seemed to echo back from heaven's closed gates like mockery of his desperate pleas for absolution. The irony burned within him like molten lead, for while murderers and thieves, adulterers and blasphemers could find forgiveness through confession and penance, he who killed only in service to earthly justice was deemed too contaminated by death to receive the sacraments that might cleanse his immortal soul, creating a cruel inversion of divine mercy that punished the servant while potentially pardoning those he had been commanded to execute. The priests and bishops who administered the Church's earthly authority found themselves caught so between doctrinal necessity and human compassion when confronted with the executioner's desperate attempts at spiritual reconciliation. For while their hearts might ache with sympathy for one so obviously tormented by his role in society's darker mechanisms, their theological training and canonical law forbade them from offering the comfort that their pastoral instincts demanded. Some clerics would engage in whispered conversations with the executioner in shadowy corners of empty churches, offering what limited spiritual counsel they could provide without violating their sacred vows, speaking in riddles and metaphors about divine understanding that transcended human judgment, while carefully avoiding any action that might be construed as formal absolution or sacramental blessing. These clandestine encounters provided the executioner with crumbs of hope that sustained his faith even as official doctrine condemned him to eternal damnation, creating an underground network of compassionate clergy who risked their own spiritual standing by acknowledging the humanity of one whom the Church had declared spiritually dead. The executioner's attempts to find alternative paths to redemption led him to seek out hermits, mystics, and holy men who lived beyond the Church's direct authority, wandering through remote forests and desolate moors in search of wisdom that might offer him salvation outside the traditional channels of organized religion. These solitary seekers, many of whom had themselves fled the contradictions and corruptions of institutional Christianity, sometimes provided the spiritual guidance that formal clergy could not, teaching him meditation techniques designed to quiet the screaming voices in his head, and offering interpretations of Scripture that emphasized divine love over doctrinal purity. In hidden caves and isolated huts, far from the judging eyes of proper society, the executioner would kneel before men who had abandoned worldly concerns to commune directly with the divine, finding in their radical spirituality a glimmer of hope that his profession need not damn his soul eternally, that perhaps in the final accounting, God would judge him by his intentions rather than his actions. Yet even these alternative sources of spiritual comfort could not completely heal the wound that theological rejection had carved into his heart, for he remained fundamentally alone in his struggle to reconcile his necessary role as death's agent with his human need for divine forgiveness, forever suspended between heaven and earth, like the condemned souls he dispatched, seeking a redemption that seemed as elusive as morning mist and as distant as the stars that looked down upon his nocturnal vigils with cold, eternal silence. When death finally claimed the executioner, releasing him from his earthly torment with the same finality that he had delivered to countless condemned souls. His passage into eternity was marked not by the solemn ceremonies and sacred rituals that eased other mortals into their final rest, but by a hasty, shameful disposal that reflected society's urgent need to erase all traces of one who had served its darkest purposes while remaining forever unwelcome at its hearth. No bells tolled in the cathedral towers to announce his departure from the world of the living. No mourners gathered to speak of his virtues or lament his passing. No priest would consent to offer the final rites that might ease his soul's transition from this realm to whatever judgment awaited beyond the veil of mortality. Instead, his death was greeted with the same relief that might accompany the removal of a festering wound, as if his absence could somehow cleanse the community of the collective guilt that had accumulated around the institution he had represented with such grim dedication throughout his cursed existence. The Church's rejection followed the executioner even into death, denying his corpse the sanctuary of consecrated ground, where generations of faithful Christians had laid their bones to rest, in the blessed hope of eventual resurrection, when Christ returned to judge the living and the dead. While murderers who had repented on the scaffold, thieves who had found salvation in their final moments, and sinners of every description could purchase their way into hallowed earth through deathbed confessions and generous donations to clerical coffers. The executioner's remains were deemed too corrupted by their association with deliberate killing to share space with the graves of ordinary believers. His body was consigned instead to the unhallowed ground beyond the churchyard walls, where suicides, excommunicates, and unbaptized infants found their final resting place among brambles and weeds, unmarked by crosses or headstones that might draw divine attention to their presence, forgotten by official memory as completely as if they had never drawn breath in the world of the living. The actual burial took place under cover of darkness, conducted by whatever unfortunate souls could be bribed or coerced into handling the contaminated remains, usually fellow outcasts or desperate paupers who needed the meager payment more than they feared the spiritual consequences of their participation in this unholy interment. The grave itself was dug hastily and without ceremony, a shallow depression in unconsecrated soil that would receive the executioner's body wrapped in rough burlap rather than the fine shrouds that graced the corpses of respectable citizens. While those who performed this final service worked in nervous haste, eager to complete their grim task and flee before dawn might reveal their participation in what was essentially a clandestine disposal of human remains. No prayers were spoken over the grave. No holy water blessed the disturbed earth. No flowers or memorial tokens marked the spot where one who had served society's needs for justice now moldered in anonymous obscurity. Perhaps most tragic of all was the knowledge that the executioner's death brought no peace to his tormented spirit. For the same superstitions that had plagued his living days extended beyond the grave to transform him into a restless phantom, doomed to wander the earth in search of the redemption that had been denied to him in life. His unquiet soul joining the ranks of the countless executed who were believed to haunt the places where they had met their end, creating an eternal procession of the damned, where servant and victim walked together through the shadowlands that existed between heaven and hell. Across the patchwork tapestry of medieval Europe, where kingdoms rose and fell like waves upon distant shores, and local customs varied as dramatically as the changing seasons. The executioner's fate was shaped by regional traditions and cultural attitudes that could transform his existence from merely miserable to utterly unbearable, or occasionally grant him small mercies that made his cursed profession slightly more tolerable than the universal condemnation that awaited his counterparts in neighboring lands. In the Germanic territories, where ancient tribal customs still held sway over newer Christian sensibilities, Executioners were sometimes accorded a grudging respect, born from the warrior culture's understanding of necessary violence. Their services viewed as an extension of the battlefield justice that had governed these lands since time immemorial. Though even this relative tolerance was tempered by the same superstitions and religious prohibitions that plagued their profession elsewhere. The Holy Roman Empire's complex legal traditions created a labyrinthine system where executioners might find themselves elevated to positions of modest authority in one principality while being treated as untouchable pariahs in an adjacent duchy, their status dependent upon the whims of local rulers and the particular interpretation of canon law favored by regional ecclesiastical authorities. In the sun-drenched lands of Mediterranean Europe, where Roman legal traditions had merged with Christian doctrine to create sophisticated judicial systems, executioners sometimes enjoyed marginally better treatment due to their role in upholding the elaborate ceremonies of justice that characterized these civilizations. Though their improved status came at the cost of increased public scrutiny and more demanding performance standards. The Italian city-states, with their merchant-dominated governments and pragmatic approaches to social order, occasionally treated their executioners as necessary civil servants whose competence was more important than their spiritual purity. Though this practical attitude rarely extended to genuine social acceptance or integration into the broader community. Spanish executioners labored under the particularly harsh judgment of the Inquisition, which viewed their profession with suspicion and subjected them to intense theological scrutiny that could result in accusations of heresy or consorting with demonic forces, creating an additional layer of persecution that made their already difficult lives nearly unbearable. The northern kingdoms of England, Scotland, and the Norse territories developed their own distinctive approaches to the executioner's role, often incorporating elements of their pre-Christian traditions that sometimes granted these figures a quasi-shamanic status as intermediaries between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. English common law created more standardized procedures for execution that provided executioners with clearer guidelines and modest legal protections. Though social ostracism remained as fierce as anywhere else in Christendom, while Scottish Highland culture's emphasis on clan honor and blood feuds created particularly dangerous working conditions for those who took lives in the name of royal justice rather than family vengeance. The Scandinavian countries, influenced by their seafaring traditions and relatively egalitarian social structures, sometimes allowed executioners to supplement their income through other trades, though the bitter irony remained that even in these more tolerant societies, the fundamental contradiction between Christian mercy and judicial killing could never be fully resolved. Perhaps most fascinating of all were the border regions where different cultures met and mingled, creating unique hybrid traditions that might grant executioners unexpected privileges or subject them to novel forms of persecution, as local populations struggled to reconcile competing systems of law, religion, and social custom that pulled their understanding of justice in contradictory directions, leaving these servants of death to navigate an ever-changing landscape of acceptance and rejection that reflected the broader tensions of medieval European civilization. When fate's cruel hand thrust women into the executioner's role, whether through the death of fathers or husbands who left no male heirs to inherit their cursed profession, or through the desperate circumstances that occasionally forced widows to assume any available means of survival, these unfortunate souls faced a double burden of condemnation that surpassed even the terrible isolation endured by their male counterparts. Medieval society, which already viewed women as inherently weaker vessels prone to corruption and spiritual contamination, recoiled with particular horror from the spectacle of female hands wielding the instruments of death, seeing in such figures a fundamental violation of the natural order that placed women in roles of nurturing and life-giving rather than destruction and ending. The female executioner became a figure of such profound revulsion that she transcended ordinary social rejection to become something approaching a mythological monster, a creature whose very existence challenged the foundational assumptions about gender, divinity, and the proper ordering of human society that medieval minds used to make sense of their world. The physical demands of execution, challenging enough for men trained from childhood in the use of heavy weapons and tools, became nearly insurmountable obstacles for women whose bodies had not been shaped by years of martial training or manual labor, forcing them to develop alternative techniques and methods that often prolonged the suffering of their victims and increased the displeasure of crowds that expected swift, clean deaths rather than the fumbling attempts of those whose strength was insufficient for their terrible task. A woman struggling to lift a heavy executioner's axe or unable to calculate the proper rope length for a hanging due to unfamiliarity with the mathematical principles involved would find herself facing not only the usual contempt directed at all executioners, but also the particular scorn reserved for those who failed to perform their duties with the competence that the public demanded. The cruel irony was that society simultaneously forced these women into positions they were ill-equipped to handle, while condemning them for their inevitable failures, creating a cycle of humiliation and inadequacy that compounded the already overwhelming psychological pressures of their profession. The sexual vulnerability of female executioners created additional layers of danger and exploitation that their male colleagues never faced, as their isolation and desperation made them targets for those who sought to satisfy their basest urges with victims who had no recourse to legal protection or social support. These women lived in constant fear not only of the usual threats of revenge from relatives of the executed, but also of sexual violence from any man who viewed their degraded status as an invitation to assault without consequence, their bodies becoming battlegrounds where the violence they inflicted professionally was returned upon them personally in acts of rape and brutalization that went unpunished and often unacknowledged by authorities who considered such treatment an acceptable part of their degraded existence. The psychological trauma of sexual assault, combined with the already crushing burden of professional guilt, created wounds that never healed, leaving these women to navigate a world where they were simultaneously required to take life and powerless to protect their own bodies from violation. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all was the knowledge that female executioners faced not only social rejection, but also biological consequences that could extend their suffering to future generations, as any children born to them would inherit not only the traditional curses associated with the executioner's bloodline, but also the additional stigma of illegitimate birth and maternal contamination, creating family lines marked by compound layers of social rejection that made escape from their cursed heritage virtually impossible. The executioner's tools existed as extensions of his corrupted soul, each instrument of death requiring not only meticulous craftsmanship and constant maintenance, but also serving as a physical manifestation of society's darkest necessities, transforming simple metal and wood into objects that carried the weight of divine judgment and human mortality. The great executioner's axe, with its broad blade forged from the finest steel and balanced with mathematical precision to deliver swift, merciful death, demanded the skills of master blacksmiths who worked reluctantly on such commissions, their hammers ringing against anvils with the knowledge that each strike helped create an instrument of deliberate killing rather than the honest tools of agriculture or craftsmanship that normally emerged from their forges. The handle, carved from seasoned oak or ash, required careful attention to grain and balance, for any imperfection might cause the blade to turn at the crucial moment, transforming a swift execution into a prolonged agony that would haunt both victim and executioner while inciting the wrath of bloodthirsty crowds who expected death to arrive with the precision of a master craftsman's finest work. The hangman's rope represented perhaps the most symbolically charged of all execution instruments. Its 13 coils wound according to ancient tradition that supposedly ensured the condemned soul's passage into the afterlife. Though the executioner understood with bitter irony that no amount of ritual precision could cleanse either the rope or his hands of the spiritual contamination that accumulated with each life taken. The hemp fibers from which these ropes were woven had to be specially treated and blessed by whatever clergy could be convinced to participate in such grim preparations, while the knot itself became a work of dark artistry that required precise positioning beneath the left ear to ensure that the falling weight shawl would snap the neck cleanly, rather than slowly strangling the victim in a spectacle that would traumatize witnesses and reflect poorly upon the executioner's professional competence. Each rope could only be used once before it became too contaminated for further service, requiring constant replacement and the maintenance of an inventory that served as a grim reminder of how many souls had passed through the executioner's hands into whatever realm awaited beyond the veil of mortal existence. The more elaborate instruments of torture and execution demanded not only craftsmanship, but also a deep understanding of human anatomy and psychology, as devices like the breaking wheel, the rack, and the Iron Maiden were designed to maximize suffering while maintaining the victim's consciousness for as long as possible, creating mechanical marvels of cruelty that represented the pinnacle of medieval engineering applied to the most horrific purposes imaginable. The executioner was required to understand the precise operation of these complex machines, knowing which levers to pull and which screws to turn to achieve the desired effect, while also maintaining the intricate mechanisms that could mean the difference between swift death and prolonged agony, depending upon their proper adjustment and lubrication. The irony was not lost upon him that while other craftsmen took pride in creating objects of beauty and utility that enriched human life, his expertise lay in perfecting instruments whose sole purpose was the systematic destruction of human bodies and spirits. Beyond their practical function, these tools carried symbolic weight that transformed them into relics of a darker faith, objects that seemed to radiate malevolent energy even when not in use, their very presence serving as reminders of mortality and divine judgment that could strike fear into the hearts of even the most hardened criminals, while their maintenance and storage created sacred rituals of death that bound the executioner ever more tightly to his cursed calling. The executioner's existence balanced precariously upon the shifting sands of political fortune, his fate as changeable as the winds that swept across medieval battlefields, where kingdoms rose and fell with the clash of steel and the spilling of royal blood, leaving him perpetually vulnerable to the whims and calculations of rulers who viewed him as nothing more than a useful tool to be employed or discarded according to the demands of statecraft and survival. When a new lord ascended to power through conquest, inheritance, or political maneuvering, the executioner would wait in anxious isolation to learn whether his services would be retained under the new regime or whether he would become a convenient scapegoat for the previous administration's unpopular policies, his head potentially joining those he had severed in service to masters who no longer held the power to protect him from the vengeful justice of their successors. The cruel irony of his position was that while he served the abstract concept of justice, his actual employment depended upon the personal preferences and political needs of individuals who might decide that eliminating their predecessor's executioner would demonstrate their commitment to mercy and reform, or conversely, that retaining such a figure would send a clear message about their willingness to employ lethal force against those who challenged their authority. The relationship between executioner and political authority was was poisoned by mutual distrust and pragmatic necessity, creating a bond that resembled nothing so much as a marriage between scorpion and spider, where each party needed the other but could never fully trust that their alliance would survive the next crisis or opportunity for advancement. Lords and magistrates who employed the executioner's services understood that his knowledge of their methods, their victims, and their political calculations made him a potential liability who might someday testify against them if circumstances changed and former allies became enemies in the deadly game of medieval politics. This knowledge created an atmosphere of perpetual tension, where the executioner was simultaneously indispensable and expendable, valued for his expertise in eliminating problems while being constantly evaluated as a problem himself that might require elimination when political winds shifted and yesterday's necessary violence became today's embarrassing liability that needed to be erased from memory. The executioner's dependence upon political patronage extended beyond mere employment to encompass every aspect of his survival, from the modest compensation that kept him alive to the legal protections that shielded him from revenge-seeking relatives of his victims, creating a relationship of absolute servitude where he could make no demands and assert no rights beyond those his masters chose to grant him. When wars erupted and rival claimants battled for control of territories, the executioner faced the terrifying prospect of being caught between opposing forces, his past service to one side marking him as an enemy of the other, regardless of his personal loyalties or political preferences, transforming him into a military target whose elimination might serve both practical and symbolic purposes for conquering armies seeking to demonstrate their power and erase the memory of previous regimes. The smart executioner learned to read political omens with the skill of a court astrologer, watching for signs that might indicate approaching changes in leadership and preparing to flee or hide when necessary. Though such preparations were often futile given his distinctive skills and reputation that made him recognizable regardless of where he might attempt to seek refuge. Most devastating of all was the knowledge that no political alliance could provide him with genuine security or lasting protection. For even the most powerful rulers were themselves subject to the vagaries of fortune and the machinations of ambitious rivals, leaving the executioner to serve masters who might themselves face the scaffold before their reigns concluded, creating an endless cycle of uncertainty where death remained the only reliable constant in a world where everything else shifted like smoke in a winter wind. The desperate dream of escape haunted the executioner's waking hours like a persistent fever, driving him to fantasize about distant lands where his face was unknown and his cursed profession might be buried beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. Yet the practical reality of medieval travel and communication made such dreams as elusive as morning mist that dissolves beneath the harsh light of dawn. The very skills that defined his professional identity became shackles that bound him to his fate, for the intimate knowledge of anatomy required for swift executions, the familiarity with torture devices and their operation, and the calloused hands marked by years of wielding death's instruments created a combination of attributes that would inevitably betray him to anyone with experience in such matters, marking him as surely as if he bore the executioner's brand burned into his flesh. Even if he could somehow reach a foreign kingdom where his reputation had not preceded him, the distinctive scars that marked his trade, the rope burns on his palms, the muscle development that came from years of swinging heavy axes, the psychological tics and nervous habits that betrayed his intimate familiarity with violence, would eventually draw suspicion from those who knew what signs to seek in one who had trafficked so extensively with death. The few executioners who attempted to construct new identities for themselves in distant territories faced the nearly impossible task of inventing plausible histories that could withstand scrutiny from suspicious authorities or curious neighbors who might wonder about the origins of a stranger with no apparent trade, no family connections, and no references from previous employers willing to vouch for his character and competence. The medieval world's reliance on personal relationships and community vouching made it extraordinarily difficult for anyone to simply appear in a new location without raising questions about their past, while the executioner's lack of legitimate skills or experiences that could be safely discussed made him particularly vulnerable to exposure when forced to explain his background under questioning. His attempts to learn new trades were hampered by the psychological damage that his profession had inflicted upon his mind and spirit, leaving him struggling to master the patient, creative work of honest craftsmanship when his hands had been trained only for destruction, and his thoughts remained haunted by memories that interfered with concentration and normal human interaction. The psychological barriers to successful escape often proved more insurmountable than the practical obstacles, as years of isolation and spiritual corruption had so thoroughly marked the executioner's soul that he found himself unable to convincingly portray the innocence and normalcy that would be required to blend into a community of ordinary citizens who had never been forced to take human life in service to abstract justice. His dreams were populated by the faces of those he had executed, his reflexes attuned to violence in ways that would inevitably surface during moments of stress or conflict, and his understanding of human nature had been so thoroughly poisoned by his professional experiences that he could not easily engage in the simple social interactions that formed the foundation of community life, making him appear strange and potentially dangerous, even when he was making genuine efforts to reform his character and assume a new identity. Perhaps most tragically of all, the executioner's escape attempts were ultimately doomed to a fundamental truth that he could never truly flee from himself, carrying within his corrupted soul the accumulated weight of every life he had taken, every scream he had heard, every final breath he had witnessed, creating an internal prison that would follow him wherever he might go and ensure that even if he could somehow evade human pursuit, he would remain forever trapped within the hell of his own memories and guilt. The executioner's body bore the accumulated damage of his profession like a living testament to the physical toll that death's work extracted from those who served its demands, with every joint and muscle carrying the permanent scars of repetitive violence that transformed the human frame into a catalog of occupational injuries that no honest trade would inflict upon its practitioners. The constant wielding of heavy axes and the precise movements required for effective beheading created a distinctive pattern of skeletal deformation that marked veteran executioners as surely as any guild symbol, their spines curved from years of bending over chopping blocks, their shoulders permanently hunched from the weight of iron implements, and their wrists thickened and gnarled from the shock of blade meeting bone that reverberated through their arms with each successful execution. The irony was bitter indeed that while the executioner delivered swift death to others, his own body died by slow degrees, each swing of the axe and adjustment of the noose contributing to a gradual destruction that would eventually leave him crippled and broken long before natural aging claimed his life, creating a form of cosmic justice that seemed to balance the scales through the systematic destruction of the destroyer. The psychological stress of his profession manifested in physical symptoms that compounded the mechanical injuries of his trade, as chronic anxiety and perpetual fear created a cascade of ailments that attacked every system of his tormented body with relentless persistence. His digestive system, constantly churning with nervous energy and the acids of guilt, would rebel against even the simplest foods, leaving him perpetually undernourished and weak despite his need for physical strength to perform his duties effectively, while his cardiovascular system bore the strain of hearts that raced with terror before each execution and then plummeted into exhausted depression when the terrible work was done. Sleep disorders plagued him with such consistency that insomnia became his normal state, leaving him to stumble through his days in a fog of exhaustion that made his dangerous work even more perilous, while the constant nightmares that did manage to penetrate his consciousness left him more tired upon waking than he had been when he attempted to rest. The unsanitary conditions in which the executioner was forced to work created additional health hazards that respectable tradesmen never faced, as the blood and bodily fluids that were inevitable byproducts of his profession carried diseases and infections that could enter his system through the smallest cut or abrasion on hands that were perpetually exposed to contamination. The medieval understanding of disease transmission was primitive at best, leaving the executioner to work in conditions that would horrify modern medical practitioners, surrounded by rotting flesh, stagnant blood pools, and the accumulated filth of dungeon cells where hygiene was non-existent, and pest infestation was the norm rather than the exception. His immune system, already compromised by poor nutrition and chronic stress, was further weakened by constant exposure to pathogens that thrived in the charnel house environment of execution grounds and torture chambers, making him susceptible to plagues and fevers that might spare those whose work kept them in cleaner surroundings. Perhaps most cruel of all was the knowledge that when injury or illness finally rendered the executioner incapable of performing his duties, no pension or support system awaited him in his declining years, leaving him to face poverty, abandonment, and potentially starvation as the inevitable reward for a lifetime spent in service to society's darkest needs, his broken body becoming as unwanted and disposable as the corpses he had helped to create throughout his cursed career. The children born into the executioner's cursed bloodline entered the world already damned by circumstances beyond their control, their tiny hands destined to hold the same instruments of death that had stained their father's soul, their innocent laughter doomed to be silenced by the weight of inherited shame that would press upon their shoulders from the moment they could understand the meaning of their family name. These small souls, who should have spent their early years learning nursery rhymes and playing innocent games beneath the warm sunshine of childhood's golden hours, instead grew up in the shadow of the gallows, their playground the execution grounds where their father practiced his grim trade, their lullabies the whispered instructions in anatomical precision that would prepare them for the only profession that medieval society would permit them to pursue. The cruel mathematics of hereditary guilt ensured that no amount of personal virtue, no display of intelligence or artistic talent, no demonstration of moral character could overcome the fundamental contamination that flowed through their veins like poison, marking them from birth as future servants of death who would continue the family tradition not out of choice, but from the inexorable pressure of social necessity and legal requirement. The education of these doomed children proceeded along lines that would have horrified any normal parent, as fathers who should have been teaching their sons to read and write, to appreciate beauty and create rather than destroy, were instead compelled to pass down the technical knowledge that would enable the next generation to carry out swift, merciful executions with the professional competence that their position demanded. Young boys who might have shown aptitude for scholarship, craftsmanship, or artistic endeavor found themselves studying the precise angle required for clean beheading, the mathematical calculations necessary for proper hanging, and the anatomical knowledge that would allow them to operate torture devices with maximum efficiency and minimum prolonged suffering for their victims. Their small hands were guided by calloused paternal fingers as they learned to grip the executioner's axe, their developing minds filled with information about human mortality that no child should ever possess. Their natural curiosity about the world channeled into dark expertise that would ensure their perpetual exile from normal human society. The psychological development of executioners' children was warped by the impossible contradiction between their human need for love and acceptance and the reality of their social position as future pariahs who would be forever rejected by the very community they were destined to serve. These young souls learned early that other children would flee from their approach, that mothers would cross themselves and hurry their families away when the executioner's offspring appeared in market squares or village festivals, that even the most desperate playmates would eventually abandon them when the full weight of their family's reputation became clear through whispered conversations and frightened glances. The isolation bred a particular kind of psychological damage that was perhaps even more devastating than the trauma experienced by adult executioners. For while grown men could at least remember what it felt like to be accepted and loved before their profession destroyed their humanity, these children knew only rejection from their earliest memories, creating a fundamental understanding of themselves as monsters who deserved the hatred and fear that society directed toward them with such consistency. Most heartbreaking of all was the knowledge that these innocent victims of hereditary curse would themselves become parents someday, forced to repeat the cycle of corruption by passing their own dark legacy to the next generation of doomed children, creating an endless procession of sacrificial souls who would serve society's need for justice while remaining forever excluded from the warmth and fellowship that made life worth living. In the vast tapestry of medieval cruelty and rejection, there occasionally appeared threads of unexpected mercy that shimmered like gold against the dark weave of the executioner's fate. Rare moments when the iron laws of social condemnation bent before the greater forces of political necessity, religious revelation, or simple human compassion that reminded even the most hardened observers that redemption remained possible even for those who had trafficked so intimately with death. These miraculous interventions typically arose during times of great upheaval, when traditional hierarchies crumbled and new rulers sought to demonstrate their enlightened nature by granting pardons to those who had served their predecessors' darker purposes, or when military campaigns required the services of men skilled in violence, regardless of their previous occupations, offering executioners the chance to transform their expertise with lethal implements into honorable service on distant battlefields where their past could be buried beneath layers of martial glory. Some particularly fortunate individuals found salvation through the intervention of progressive church leaders who argued that Christ's mercy extended even to those who had administered earthly justice, or through the patronage of nobles who valued practical skills over spiritual purity and were willing to overlook social taboos in exchange for loyal service in capacities that made use of their unique talents without requiring them to continue taking lives in the public squares. The path to redemption, when it existed at all, typically required the executioner to perform extraordinary acts of service or sacrifice that demonstrated his genuine desire to escape his cursed profession and rejoin the community of acceptable humanity through deeds that outweighed the accumulated sins of his past calling. Some found their opportunity during plague years when their intimate familiarity with death made them valuable assistants to physicians overwhelmed by the magnitude of suffering, their steady hands and strong stomachs proving invaluable in caring for victims whose condition was too horrible for ordinary citizens to bear, while their social isolation actually became an advantage in situations where quarantine and separation were necessary to prevent the spread of disease. Others discovered that their knowledge of human anatomy, gained through years of swift killing, could be redirected toward healing when they assisted surgeons in primitive medical procedures that required steady nerves and precise movements, transforming their expertise in ending life into skills that preserved it. Though such transitions required years of patient work to overcome the suspicion and revulsion that their former profession had created in the minds of those they sought to help. The psychological journey from executioner to redeemed citizen demanded not only external validation, but also internal transformation that could take decades to achieve. As these men struggled to rebuild their sense of human worth and divine grace after years of believing themselves eternally damned by their profession's requirements. The process often began with small acts of kindness that gradually demonstrated their capacity for good, such as secretly providing food to starving beggars, tending to injured animals, or performing anonymous charitable works that slowly convinced observers that genuine change was possible, even in souls that had seemed irredeemably corrupted. Religious communities occasionally provided sanctuary for reformed executioners who demonstrated sincere repentance, allowing them to spend their remaining years in prayer and contemplation that might wash away the stains on their spirits through divine intervention that transcended human judgment. Yet even these rare success stories carried within them the permanent scars of their former lives. For while society might eventually forgive and forget, the executioner himself could never completely escape the memories of faces that haunted his dreams, or the knowledge that his hands had taken lives that could never be restored, creating a bittersweet redemption that offered peace without erasure, acceptance without absolution. As the centuries turned and the winds of change swept across the European continent, like spring storms carrying away the detritus of winter, the medieval world that had created and sustained the executioner's terrible profession began its slow transformation into something more recognizably modern, where Enlightenment philosophy and religious reform challenged the ancient assumptions about justice, punishment, and the state's right to take life in the name of social order. The last executioners found themselves living anachronisms, relics of a darker age whose services were requested with decreasing frequency as public sentiment shifted toward imprisonment rather than death, rehabilitation rather than retribution, and private rather than public punishment that no longer required the theatrical spectacles of suffering that had once drawn crowds to market squares and execution grounds. These final practitioners of death's art watched their profession dwindling like a candle flame guttering in the wind, understanding that they were witnessing the end of a tradition that stretched back through countless generations of their cursed bloodline, yet uncertain whether this extinction represented progress or simply a different form of societal hypocrisy that preferred to hide its violence rather than confront it honestly. The transition away from public execution created a peculiar form of unemployment for men whose only marketable skill was the swift administration of death, leaving them to contemplate futures for which nothing in their hereditary training had prepared them, their specialized knowledge becoming as obsolete as the techniques of medieval warfare in an age of gunpowder and artillery. Some attempted to reinvent themselves as private assassins or soldiers of fortune, discovering that their intimate familiarity with killing could find new markets in the shadowy world of political intrigue and commercial warfare, while others tried to leverage their anatomical knowledge into more respectable professions such as surgery or veterinary medicine. Though the stigma of their former calling often followed them like a persistent stench that no amount of good works could completely eliminate. The irony was bitter that just as society was finally ready to abandon the institution that had condemned them to lives of isolation and spiritual torment, these last executioners found themselves mourning the loss of the only identity they had ever known, discovering that freedom from their cursed profession brought its own forms of anxiety and displacement. The children of these final executioners faced an unprecedented situation, where the hereditary curse that had bound their families for generations was finally being broken by historical forces beyond their control. Yet the psychological and social damage inflicted by centuries of rejection could not be easily healed by simple changes in legal practice or philosophical fashion. These young souls, raised to expect a lifetime of isolation and spiritual condemnation, suddenly found themselves thrust into a world where their family's dark legacy was becoming irrelevant, creating identity crises that were perhaps even more disorienting than the traditional certainty of inherited damnation that had provided their ancestors with at least the comfort of clearly defined roles and expectations. The process of integration into normal society proved challenging for families whose understanding of human interaction had been shaped by generations of rejection and whose social skills had atrophied through decades of enforced isolation. Perhaps most poignantly of all, the disappearance of public execution marked not only the end of a profession, but also the conclusion of a particular chapter in humanity's relationship with mortality and justice, leaving these last executioners to serve as living bridges between the medieval world that had created them and the modern age that would ultimately forget both their suffering and their service to the darker necessities of human civilization. And so we close this haunting chapter of human history, where men lived suspended between necessity and damnation, serving society's darkest needs while forever banished from its warmth. The medieval executioner's tale reminds us that even in humanity's pursuit of justice, there are those who must bear burdens too heavy for any soul to carry, paying the ultimate price not with their lives, but with their very humanity itself. In the end, perhaps their greatest tragedy was not the isolation they endured, but that their suffering has been largely forgotten by the world they served so faithfully. Sleep well, knowing that such darkness belongs to ages past.